The laughter hit me like ice water. Sharp, mocking, designed to humiliate. I sat frozen at the cafeteria table, hands clenched beneath the surface, heart pounding against my ribs while my mind went perfectly still. He thought I'd swallow this insult like I'd swallowed so many others, that I'd sit there, the quiet woman who never fought back. But as his sneering voice echoed through the room, something shifted inside me. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, I would bring down a $50 million deal right before his eyes. My name is Emily Carter, and for 19 years, I've been the ghost in the machine at Redwood Capital Partners. You know the type, the one whose work speaks volumes while the person remains invisible. At 34, I'd grown accustomed to watching from the shadows as others claimed my victories. But that Tuesday in March, in our gleaming Chicago office cafeteria, everything changed. The lunch rush at 12:30 p.m. always transformed our corporate dining space into a battlefield of egos. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city 42 stories below, while inside, the real power plays unfolded over overpriced salads and artisanal sandwiches. I'd chosen my usual spot, third table from the windows, close enough to appear engaged, but far enough to avoid the spotlight. Jake Donovan strutted in like he owned the place, which, given his bloodline, wasn't far from the truth. 27 years old, Harvard MBA still fresh on his wall, designer suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His uncle, our CEO, Richard Donovan, had gifted him a senior management position 6 months ago, skipping over dozens of us who'd earned our stripes through decades of grunt work. Well, if it isn't our invisible woman, Jake announced, his voice cutting through the ambient chatter. He positioned himself directly in my line of sight, his entourage of junior associates flanking him like bodyguards. Emily Carter, the woman behind the curtain, tell me, how does it feel knowing that no matter how many reports you write, how many models you build, nobody will ever remember your name? The cafeteria quieted. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations died. I kept my eyes on my salad, counting the cherry tomatoes. 7. There were 7, arranged in a perfect circle. My grandmother taught me that trick. When anger threatens to consume you, count something, anything, until your mind clears. I mean, seriously, Jake continued, warming to his audience. 19 years at this company, and what do you have to show for it? A cubicle with a view of the printer? His laugh was sharp, practiced, designed to cut. Meanwhile, some of us are actually closing deals, making real money, building legacies. Someone snickered. Peterson from Mergers. A few others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah from HR stared at her phone, pretending not to hear. Marcus, who'd started the same year as me, wouldn't meet my eyes. The Watson acquisition last month? Jake leaned against a nearby table, casual, confident. That was all me. Sure, someone ran the numbers, probably you, right? But who cares about the calculator when there's a real negotiator in the room? The Watson acquisition. I'd spent 3 months building that financial model, identifying synergies others missed, creating the framework that made the deal possible. Jake had presented my work, word for word, slide for slide, to the board. Now he stood there, claiming it as naturally as breathing. Nothing to say? He tilted his head, studying me like a specimen. That's the problem with you analyst types. All spreadsheets, no spine. You think your little formulas matter. But at the end of the day, it's people like me who make things happen. We're the ones they remember. We're the ones who matter. My hands stayed steady on the table, but beneath the surface, my fingernails dug crescents into my palms. The familiar weight of invisibility pressed down, heavier than ever. How many times had I sat through this? Different faces, same dismissal, different projects, same erasure. You know what your real problem is, Emily? Jake moved closer. His cologne, something expensive and suffocating, filling the space between us. You think keeping your head down and doing good work means something, but it doesn't. Not here, not anywhere. You're just support staff, the help, and maybe that's all you're meant to be. The words hung in the air like a challenge, around us. Our colleagues watched, some with pity, others with relief that they weren't the target. This was Redwood Capital Partners, survival of the loudest. where machismo masqueraded as meritocracy. I finally looked up, meeting Jake's eyes. They were bright with triumph. Certain he'd won whatever game he thought we were playing. Behind him, mounted on the wall, hung the company's mission statement: excellence through collaboration. The irony wasn't lost on me. "You're absolutely right, Jake," I said quietly, my voice steady as granite. "Nobody remembers my name." His grin widened, mistaking my calm for surrender. I stood, gathering my barely touched lunch. "Enjoy your moment." As I walked away, I heard him laughing, heard him turning to his audience to elaborate on his victory. But I wasn't really leaving. I was just repositioning. Because Jake Donovan, in his arrogance, had just revealed something crucial. Tomorrow's $50 million merger presentation, the one that would cement his position as the company's rising star, depended entirely on the analytical framework I'd built. And he had no idea that every line of code, every algorithm, every data point in that system answered to me alone. The elevator carried me back to the 38th floor, but my mind traveled through 19 years of carefully documented injustices. I'd started at Redwood Capital Partners fresh out of Northwestern, eager to prove that a girl from Chicago's South Side could play in the big leagues. Back then, the company was smaller, hungrier, and I was one of 3 analysts tasked with building something revolutionary: a proprietary analysis system that would give us an edge over Goldman and Morgan Stanley. I remember those early days with painful clarity, working until 3 a.m., sleeping on the office couch, living on vending machine coffee and pure determination. While my classmates were discovering downtown bars and weekend trips to Michigan, I was writing code, building models, creating the algorithmic backbone that would eventually process billions in transactions. The real work started in my 3rd year when we landed the Pemberton deal, our first major acquisition. I'd identified a patent portfolio buried in their subsidiary that everyone else missed, turning a mediocre purchase into a goldmine. The presentation slides had my fingerprints all over them, but when the deal closed, it was Brad Morrison who stood at the podium, accepting congratulations for his brilliant strategic vision. "You understand, don't you, Emily?" Richard Donovan had said back then. "Still just a senior partner, not yet CEO. Brad has the relationships. Clients need to see a certain image. You're invaluable behind the scenes. But deals need closers." I understood perfectly. I understood that my analysis had saved them from a $12 million mistake in the Hartfield merger. I understood that my risk assessment model had prevented the catastrophic Singapore expansion that killed 2 of our competitors. I understood that while I architected victories, others would claim them. The pattern established itself early. The Brennan Industries restructuring that I mapped out became David Kim's triumph. The municipal bond strategy that generated 30% returns? That was attributed to the fixed income team, though they'd simply executed my playbook, year after year, deal after deal. I watched my work disappear into other people's portfolios. The cruelest blow came 7 years ago. My mother had just been diagnosed with congestive heart failure, and I was shuttling between the cardiac unit at Northwestern Memorial and the office, trying to keep both my mother and my projects alive. I'd spent months developing a revolutionary approach to analyzing distressed assets, something that could have changed the industry standard. The presentation was scheduled for a Monday. My mother went into crisis that Sunday night. I sent my work to Jennifer Walsh, my supposed mentor, asking her to present on my behalf, with clear attribution. When I returned after my mother's emergency surgery, I discovered Jennifer had not only presented my work, but had filed it under her name with the company's intellectual property department. That innovation went on to generate $40 million in revenue over 5 years. Jennifer was made partner. I received a sympathy card and a reminder that family emergencies shouldn't impact deliverables. But I adapted. I learned to embed myself so deeply in the company's infrastructure that removing me would be like performing surgery with a chainsaw. Every major analytical tool bore my invisible signature. Every database spoke my language. I became essential and anonymous simultaneously. The perfect corporate ghost. Jake Donovan's arrival 6 months ago felt like salt in old wounds. Here was everything wrong with Redwood crystallized into one person: unearned privilege wearing an expensive suit, mediocrity elevated by nepotism. I watched him fumble through presentations, mangle complex financial concepts, and mistake arrogance for authority. Yet there he was, fast-tracked to senior management while I remained in my windowless office, building the frameworks that kept the company profitable. The breaking point wasn't just his public humiliation today. It was learning last week that the $50 million Steinberg merger, the deal that would define Redwood's fiscal year, had been handed to Jake as his coming-out party. The analysis, naturally, fell to me. I'd spent 2 months crafting every detail, identifying cost synergies, mapping integration strategies, building the mathematical case for why Steinberg Industries and Redwood's newest acquisition target were perfect partners. Jake hadn't even bothered to understand the work. In our one meeting, he'd scrolled through his phone while I explained the risk matrices, occasionally grunting agreement. "Just make sure it looks good on screen," he'd said. "These deals are about confidence, not calculators." Now, standing in my office, surrounded by 19 years of invisible achievements, I stared at tomorrow's presentation files on my monitor. Every chart, every projection, every piece of data that Jake would present to Steinberg Industries ran through the authentication protocols I'd written. He didn't know about the fail-safes I'd built in. Why would he? Technical details were beneath him. My mother passed away 3 years ago, in her final days, drugged but lucid. She'd held my hand and said, "Baby, you've spent so long making other people look good. When do you get to shine?" "Soon, Mom," I'd promised, not believing it myself. I thought about her words now as I stared at Jake's presentation, at the code that underpinned everything, at the power I'd accumulated without anyone noticing. 19 years of being overlooked had taught me patience. 19 years of building in the shadows had given me control over the very foundations of Redwood's analytical capabilities. Jake thought he'd humiliated me at lunch. He thought I was just support staff, a calculator with no spine. Tomorrow, he would learn that the invisible woman he'd mocked held the keys to his kingdom. And I was about to change the locks. The cafeteria had emptied after Jake's performance, but I remained at my desk until 6:30 p.m., replaying every word, every sneer, every complicit silence from my colleagues. The humiliation wasn't new. I'd endured variations of it for years, but something about Jake's theatrical cruelty, his absolute certainty that I would simply absorb it, had crystallized years of suppressed rage into cold determination. "Nobody remembers my name," I whispered to my reflection in the black computer screen. "Let's see if they remember this." I pulled up tomorrow's merger presentation, the crown jewel of Jake's nascent career. The Steinberg Industries deal would be the largest acquisition in Redwood's history, a complex integration of their renewable energy portfolio with our traditional holdings. The boardroom would be packed, Steinberg's executives, our entire C-suite, representatives from 3 investment banks, and journalists from the Financial Times and Wall Street Journal. Jake would stand at the podium, clicking through my slides, reading my analysis, claiming my work as his vision. Except he wouldn't, not this time. The beauty of being invisible for 19 years is that nobody watches what you do. They'd never noticed me building backdoors into every system I created, never questioned why I insisted on maintaining the authentication protocols personally. To them, I was just obsessive Emily, the workaholic with no life outside these walls. They had no idea that every piece of analytical software in this building recognized my digital fingerprint as its creator. I opened the presentation's source code, my fingers moving with surgical precision. I wasn't going to delete anything. That would be too crude, too easily fixed. Instead, I implemented a simple conditional statement. Without my real-time authentication, the data would progressively degrade, displaying increasingly obvious errors that would make Jake look incompetent rather than sabotaged. The first few slides would work perfectly, lulling him into confidence. But as he dove into the financial projections, the meat of the presentation, the numbers would start to shift. Revenue projections would show impossible figures. Risk assessments would contradict themselves. The integration timeline would become a maze of circular dependencies. And the coup de grace, the final slide summarizing the deal's value, would display an error message that I'd coded years ago as a joke, never thinking I'd use it. Original authorization missing. Please verify credentials. My phone buzzed. Sarah from HR. Are you okay? That was really inappropriate at lunch. I almost laughed. Now she messages me? After sitting there, silent, while Jake performed his little power play, I didn't respond. Sarah's concern, like everything else at Redwood, was performative. By 8 p.m., I'd finished my modifications. The presentation remained perfect on the surface. Jake could review it tonight and find nothing amiss. The degradation would only trigger during the live presentation, when the system detected multiple external connections attempting to access the data simultaneously. He'd rehearse successfully in his office, walk into that boardroom tomorrow full of unearned confidence, and then watch his career implode in real time. I leaned back, considering the implications. This wasn't just about embarrassing Jake. A failed merger of this magnitude would have consequences. Stock prices would fluctuate. The board would demand answers. Richard Donovan would have to explain how his nephew had bungled the company's biggest deal. But then I remembered my mother's medical bills that Redwood's comprehensive insurance had barely covered. I thought about Jennifer Walsh's corner office, built on my stolen innovation. I pictured Brad Morrison's name on patents that should have been mine. 19 years of small deaths, each one justified by the greater good of the company. "You think your little formulas don't matter," I said aloud, mimicking Jake's sneer. "Let's test that hypothesis." I saved my changes, uploaded them to the main server, and watched as the system accepted them without question. After all, I was Emily Carter, the invisible woman who maintained these systems, who worked late every night ensuring everything ran smoothly. Who would suspect that the ghost in the machine had finally decided to haunt them? Before leaving, I did one more thing. I accessed the building's security footage from lunch, isolated the audio of Jake's mockery, and saved it to my personal drive, not for evidence. I wouldn't need to justify anything after tomorrow. I saved it as a reminder of the exact moment Jake Donovan had signed his own professional death warrant. The cleaning crew was arriving as I packed up. Maria, who'd been emptying our trash cans for the past decade, nodded at me. "Working late again, Miss Emily?" "Last time," I said, meaning it. "After tomorrow, things are going to be different." She smiled, not understanding but sensing something in my tone. "Good for you. You work too hard for these people." As I walked to the elevator, I passed Jake's office. He was still there, feet up on his desk, practicing his presentation to an imaginary audience. His voice carried through the glass. "Gentlemen, what we're proposing isn't just a merger, it's a transformation. My vision for Steinberg Industries." My vision, the words followed me into the elevator, down to the lobby, out into the Chicago night. By tomorrow afternoon, everyone would understand whose vision had really been driving Redwood's success. They'd learn what happens when you humiliate the person who built your kingdom. Jake thought he'd crushed me at lunch, reduced me to nothing in front of our peers. But he'd actually done me a favor. He'd freed me from any last obligation to protect the company that had exploited me for 19 years. Tomorrow, while he stood at that podium, watching his triumph turn to ash, he'd finally understand the truth. The invisible woman he'd mocked wasn't support staff. I was the foundation, and I was about to crumble. I didn't sleep that night, not from anxiety or second thoughts, but from the electric anticipation of watching 19 years of careful architecture finally serve its true purpose. At 3 a.m., I sat at my kitchen table, laptop open, monitoring the presentation files through my remote access. Jake had reviewed them twice, once at 10 p.m. and again at midnight. Each time, the system performed flawlessly, showing him exactly what he expected to see. The conditional triggers I'd embedded were elegant in their simplicity. They wouldn't activate until the presentation detected multiple simultaneous connections from the boardroom's IP addresses, a signature that only occurred during major client meetings. Jake could practice 100 times in his office, and everything would appear perfect. But the moment he connected to the boardroom's main display, with Steinberg's team linked in and the board members' tablets synced to follow along, my trap would spring. At 5 a.m., I was already dressed, not in my usual anonymous blazer and slacks, but in the Armani suit I'd bought 5 years ago for my mother's funeral, the one time I'd allowed myself to look like I belonged in Redwood's upper echelons. Today felt like another kind of funeral. I arrived at the office at 6:15 a.m., 2 hours before the meeting. The building was nearly empty, just security guards and a few overseas traders. I made my way to my office and began the final phase of my plan. First, I backed up every piece of work I'd created over 19 years onto encrypted drives. Not to steal, but to protect. What I was about to do would likely trigger a forensic investigation, and I wanted a clean record of my contributions, dated and time-stamped. Next, I wrote a simple script that would monitor the presentation in real time, allowing me to watch the disaster unfold from my desk. I wouldn't be in the boardroom. Someone of my level would never be invited to such a gathering, but I'd have a front-row seat to Jake's destruction. At 7:30 a.m., the building began filling up. I heard Jake's voice in the hallway, loud and confident, rehearsing key points with his assistant. "Remember," he was saying, "confidence sells deals. These numbers are just window dressing." Window dressing. 19 years of meticulous analysis reduced to decoration. I pulled up the authentication system and checked the logs. Everything was in place. The presentation would begin perfectly, establishing Jake's credibility. Slides 1 through 5 would display flawlessly the executive summary, market analysis, competitive landscape. Jake would relax, find his rhythm, maybe even throw in one of his practiced jokes. But slide 6, the financial projections, would begin the cascade. A decimal point would shift, turning a 10 million projection into 100 million, small enough that he might not notice immediately, large enough to raise eyebrows. Slide 7 would compound the error. By slide 10, the numbers would be so obviously wrong that even the most financially illiterate board member would recognize the disaster. And then, at the climax, when Jake tried to display the final valuation, the $50 million figure that justified everything, the system would lock him out entirely. No backup would work, because every backup ran through the same authentication protocol. The man who'd mocked me for being a human calculator would stand there, unable to complete basic math in front of the most important audience of his career. At 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before showtime, I received an email from Richard Donovan's assistant. "Mr. Donovan requests your presence in conference room A immediately following the Steinberg presentation for a technical review." They were already planning the post-mortem, assuming everything would go smoothly. I almost felt bad for Richard. Almost. But then I remembered how he'd stood by while his nephew humiliated me. How he'd built a culture where Jake's behavior wasn't just tolerated but rewarded. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a photo from my first day at Redwood. Young, eager, full of hope. That girl believed hard work and talent would be enough. She believed in meritocracy, in fair recognition, in the American dream that effort equals reward. It had taken 19 years to kill that naive optimism, to replace it with something harder and more practical. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, my fellow veteran. "Jake's about to present. Wish you were getting the credit you deserve." Too little, too late. Marcus, where was that sentiment yesterday when I needed someone, anyone, to speak up? At 8:55 a.m., I activated my monitoring script. The boardroom's cameras came online, showing the assembled power brokers of Chicago's financial district. The Steinberg team sat stage left, 5 executives in identical navy suits. Our board occupied the center table, Richard Donovan at its head, the investment bankers clustered near the windows, already calculating their fees. And there, at the podium, stood Jake Donovan, adjusting his tie, completely unaware that he was about to become a case study in corporate hubris. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake began, his voice carrying that inherited Donovan confidence, "today we make history." Yes, I thought, fingers poised over my keyboard like a pianist about to perform. Today we certainly do. The presentation began, Jake clicking through the opening slides with practiced ease. I watched the room's energy, saw how they leaned forward, engaged by the promise of profit. Jake was in his element, all charm and borrowed competence. Then he clicked to slide 6. The change was subtle at first, just a flicker of confusion in his eyes as he read numbers that didn't match his rehearsal. But Jake Donovan had built his entire career on a foundation of bluff and bravado. He pressed on, assuming he'd simply misremembered. By slide 8, sweat had begun to bead on his forehead. By slide 10, the room had noticed something was wrong. And I sat in my small office, watching the beginning of the end, feeling neither joy nor regret, just the cold satisfaction of a debt finally being collected. The boardroom of Redwood Capital Partners had been designed to intimidate. 42nd floor, panoramic views of the Chicago skyline, a massive oak table that could seat 30, and walls lined with the tombstones of billion-dollar deals. At 9 a.m. sharp, it held the financial equivalent of royalty, people whose decisions moved markets and destroyed careers. Jake stood at the smart podium, his initial confidence radiating through the room. The first 5 slides had landed perfectly. I watched through my monitor as Harold Steinberg himself nodded approvingly at the market analysis. The investment bankers from Goldman were already whispering numbers. Everything was going according to Jake's plan. Then came slide 6. As you can see, Jake said smoothly, our projected first-year returns from the renewable portfolio integration are... He paused, squinting at the screen. The number read $187 million instead of $18.7 million. A nervous laugh escaped him. Apologies. Seems we have a slight formatting issue. The actual projection is... But slide 7 had already loaded automatically. Building on the error, the compound interest calculations now showed returns exceeding the entire value of Steinberg Industries. Jake's hand trembled slightly as he clicked back, trying to return to slide 6, but the number had changed again, now showing negative $187 million. Technical difficulties, Jake announced, his voice cracking slightly. If we could just... Mr. Donovan, interrupted Harold Steinberg, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Are you telling us you don't know your own projections? The room's energy shifted. The friendly anticipation curdled into something predatory. These were sharks, and they'd just smelled blood. Jake clicked forward desperately, hoping to find stable ground. Slide 8 should have shown the integration timeline, a masterpiece of project management I'd spent 3 weeks perfecting. Instead, it displayed a Gantt chart where every task was scheduled to begin in the year 2087. Nervous laughter rippled through the room, but it wasn't kind. This isn't. Jake was unraveling. His assistant rushed forward with a laptop, trying to load a backup version. But of course, it ran through the same authentication system. The screen flickered and displayed. Access denied. Original authorization required. Richard Donovan stood up, his face flushed with embarrassment and rage. Jake, what the hell is going on? It's the system, Jake said, his voice rising with panic. Something's wrong with the system. This isn't what I rehearsed. Someone must have... Someone? Harold Steinberg's voice was ice. Are you suggesting sabotage, Mr. Donovan? Or are you simply unprepared? The Goldman representatives were already packing their portfolios. One of them hadn't even bothered to hide his smirk. The journalist from the Financial Times was typing furiously on her phone. Tomorrow's headline was writing itself. Jake clicked frantically through the remaining slides, each one worse than the last. The risk assessment showed every investment as catastrophic failure imminent. The competitive analysis claimed Redwood's main competitor was a company that doesn't exist yet but probably will soon. The regulatory compliance section was replaced entirely with lorem ipsum text. But the crescendo, the moment I'd engineered with particular care, came when Jake reached the final slide, the one that should have shown the $50 million valuation that justified everything. The screen went black. Then, slowly, words appeared in corporate redwood blue. Original authorization missing. Please verify credentials. Below that, in smaller text. This analysis was created by Emily Carter, 19 years of experience, 0 years of recognition. The room erupted. Richard Donovan's face went from red to purple. Harold Steinberg stood up, his entire team following suit. This is insulting, Steinberg said, his voice deadly quiet. We flew here from Boston for this? For an incompetent presentation by someone who clearly has no grasp of his own data? Harold, please, Richard Donovan started, but Steinberg held up his hand. I know Emily Carter's work, Steinberg said, and my heart stopped. I've been reading her analyses for years, even if her name was never on them. If she's the actual brain behind your operations, perhaps you should have had her presenting instead of... He looked at Jake with undisguised contempt. Whatever this is... Jake stood frozen at the podium, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. His carefully styled hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. His expensive suit was soaked with flop sweat. Fix it, Richard hissed at his nephew. Now. I can't, Jake whispered. I don't know how. Emily built all of this. The whole system is hers. The truth hung in the air like an accusation. 19 years of hidden labor suddenly visible, undeniable, catastrophic in its absence. Get her, Richard barked at his assistant. Get Emily Carter in here right now. I watched through my monitor as the assistant scrambled out of the boardroom. In about 30 seconds, she'd reach my office. I had a choice to make. Play the savior, fix the presentation, and accept whatever crumbs of recognition they'd throw my way, or let it burn. I thought about Jake's sneer. Nobody remembers my name. I thought about my mother dying while I built systems that made other people rich. I thought about 19 years of being invisible. The assistant knocked on my door. Emily, Mr. Donovan needs you in the boardroom, immediately. I stood, smoothed my Armani suit, and picked up my laptop. But I also grabbed something else. My resignation letter, typed at 4 a.m. that morning, effective immediately. As I walked toward the boardroom, toward the wreckage of Jake's career and the implosion of Redwood's biggest deal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 19 years. Power. The boardroom doors opened before me like the gates to an execution chamber, except I wasn't the one about to be executed. 200 eyes turned in my direction, a mixture of desperation, confusion, and barely contained rage. The mighty of Chicago's financial district, reduced to waiting for the invisible woman to save them. Jake still stood at the podium, diminished. His earlier bravado evaporated like morning dew under a harsh sun. His tie was askew, his face pale except for 2 bright spots of humiliation on his cheeks. When he saw me, something flickered in his eyes. Hope? Fear? The recognition that he'd gravely miscalculated? Emily, Richard Donovan's voice boomed across the room. Thank God. We're having technical difficulties with the presentation. We need you to fix this, now. I walked slowly to the center of the room, my heels clicking against the marble floor in the absolute silence. The Steinberg team watched me with interest. The Goldman representatives had stopped packing, sensing drama worth witnessing. The journalist was practically vibrating with anticipation. Technical difficulties? I repeated, setting my laptop on the conference table with deliberate calm. That's interesting. The system was working perfectly when I checked it this morning. Can you fix it or not? Richard demanded. I looked around the room, taking in every face. These were the people who had benefited from my invisible labor for 19 years. They'd grown rich on algorithms I'd written, deals I'd structured, analyses I'd perfected. Not one of them knew my face until this moment. Of course I can fix it, I said. I built it. Relief flooded Richard's face. Then please. But first, I continued, I think everyone should understand what happened here. I turned to address the room directly. The presentation Mr. Jake Donovan just attempted to deliver was built entirely on analytical frameworks I created. Every projection, every model, every piece of data flows through systems I designed and maintained for the past 19 years. Jake stepped forward. Emily, this isn't the time. Isn't it? I pulled out my phone and connected it to the room's audio system. Yesterday, Mr. Donovan felt it was the appropriate time to publicly humiliate me in the company cafeteria. Let me share with you all what he said. Before anyone could stop me, I played the recording. Jake's voice filled the boardroom. Nobody will ever remember your name. You're just support staff, the help, and maybe that's all you're meant to be. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Harold Steinberg leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. Is that you speaking, Mr. Donovan? Jake's mouth opened, but no words came out. That was yesterday at lunch, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. 12 hours before the biggest presentation of his career, a presentation built entirely on my work, which he's never bothered to understand because, in his words, it's just spreadsheets. Emily, Richard warned, whatever personal grievances you have are entirely relevant, Harold Steinberg interrupted. Please continue, Ms. Carter. I opened my laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. The main screen flickered, and suddenly the presentation was perfect again. Every number correct, every projection accurate, every chart exactly as I designed it. Gasps echoed through the room. The system didn't malfunction, I explained. It functioned exactly as designed. It requires authentication from its creator, me, to display properly during critical presentations, a fail-safe I built years ago to ensure data integrity. I paused, letting the implications sink in. Mr. Donovan never knew this because he never bothered to learn how the system worked. He just assumed it would perform for him, like I always have. I clicked through the slides, showing the brilliant analysis that would have sealed the Steinberg deal. This merger would have been transformative. The renewable energy integration I designed would have generated approximately $53 million in the first year alone, ramping up to $200 million by year 5. The risk mitigation strategies I developed would have protected both companies from market volatility while maximizing growth potential. Would have? Richard's voice was strained. Yes, would have. I closed my laptop. Because I'm done being invisible. I pulled out my resignation letter and placed it on the table. Effective immediately, 19 years of building the analytical backbone of this company, and not once was my name on a deal announcement. Not once was I invited to a closing dinner. Not once was I recognized as anything more than support staff. You can't just leave, Richard sputtered. You have obligations. My obligation was to do excellent work, which I did. Your obligation was to treat me with professional respect, which you didn't. I turned to Harold Steinberg. Mr. Steinberg, I apologize that you've wasted your time today. For what it's worth, this merger would have been extraordinary for both companies. Steinberg studied me for a long moment. Ms. Carter, would you be interested in a conversation about joining Steinberg Industries? The room exploded. Richard Donovan shot to his feet. Harold, you can't be serious. She just sabotaged. She revealed, Steinberg corrected coldly. She revealed that your company is so poorly managed that you let a nephew who can't understand basic financial modeling lead a $50 million presentation. She revealed that the actual talent in your organization has been systematically overlooked and disrespected. And she revealed that Redwood Capital Partners is a house of cards built on the unrecognized brilliance of people you treat as invisible. He stood, his team rising with him. This deal is dead, and Mr. Donovan, he looked directly at Jake, who seemed to be trying to disappear into the floor. You might want to consider another career, perhaps something that doesn't require understanding spreadsheets. The Steinberg team filed out, followed quickly by the Goldman representatives. The journalist lingered, clearly composing her story in real time. Within hours, the financial press would be dissecting the most spectacular deal collapse in Chicago's recent history. Jake finally found his voice. You destroyed everything. For what? Petty revenge? I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. He wasn't intimidating. He was just a small man in an expensive suit, propped up by privilege he'd never earned. No, Jake, you destroyed everything the moment you decided I was nobody. I just made sure everyone could see it. The aftermath was swift and merciless. Within minutes of the Steinberg team's departure, Richard Donovan's facade of corporate composure crumbled entirely. His face, already flushed with humiliation, darkened to an alarming shade as he turned on his nephew. You incompetent fool, he snarled, each word dripping with venom. Do you have any idea what you've just cost us? Jake, still standing at the now useless podium, tried to deflect. Uncle Richard, she sabotaged. She exposed you. Richard slammed his hand on the conference table, making several board members flinch. $50 million. Gone. Our reputation. Destroyed. And why? Because you couldn't resist humiliating the one person who actually knows how to do the work. The remaining board members watched in stunned silence. These were people who'd weathered market crashes and hostile takeovers, but none had seen anything quite like this. A company's critical infrastructure turned against it by the very person they'd ignored. Margaret Chen, the board's longest-serving member, spoke up. Richard, we need damage control. The press. The press already has their story, interrupted David Larson, the CFO, looking at his phone. Financial Times just posted a breaking news alert. Redwood Capital merger collapses in spectacular fashion as hidden talent rebels. Every phone in the room began buzzing simultaneously. Twitter was already trending #invisible no more. Someone had leaked the audio of Jake's cafeteria humiliation speech, and it was going viral in financial circles. Emily, Richard's voice had shifted from rage to desperation. "Surely we can work something out. A promotion, a substantial raise, your name on the door." "Now you want to put my name on something?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "For 19 years, I've watched you put other people's names on my work. Jennifer Walsh made partner with my innovation. Brad Morrison built his reputation on my analyses. And your nephew here was about to claim credit for a merger strategy that took me 2 months to perfect." "Name your price," Richard said bluntly. "What will it take to fix this?" The room held its breath. Everyone knew Richard Donovan didn't negotiate. He dictated, but here he was, reduced to begging the woman his nephew had called the help. "There is no price," I said simply. "You can't buy back 19 years. You can't purchase the respect you should have shown from the beginning, and you certainly can't afford what I'm worth now that everyone knows it." My phone buzzed. A text from Harold Steinberg. "My offer stands. Senior Vice President, Analytical Strategy, your name on everything you create." I showed the text to the room, watching Richard's face contort with fresh fury. "You orchestrated this," he accused. "You've been talking to Steinberg." "I've never spoken to Harold Steinberg before today," I replied calmly. "But apparently, he's been reading my work for years. He recognized my analytical signature even when my name was stripped from it. Funny how competitors noticed what you couldn't see right in front of you." Jake finally found his courage, or perhaps his desperation. "You're going to destroy the company over a few insulting words? That's psychotic." "No," said Margaret Chen, surprising everyone. "What's psychotic is creating a culture where talent like Ms. Carter's is systematically suppressed while mediocrity," she looked pointedly at Jake, "is elevated through nepotism." Other board members began nodding. The spell was breaking. Without the crisis to unite them, they were remembering their own grievances with Richard's management style. "I've been saying for years that our talent retention is abysmal," David Larson added. "Now we know why. How many Emily Carters have we lost because they were invisible to leadership?" "This is a coup," Richard hissed. "You're all turning on me because of one presentation?" "It's not just one presentation," I interjected. "Pull up any major deal from the last decade. Check the metadata on the files. You'll find my digital fingerprints on every single one. The Morrison acquisition? I identified the tax advantages that made it profitable. The Shanghai expansion? I built the risk model that kept you from losing hundreds of millions. The cryptocurrency pivot that you claimed was your vision. Richard, I wrote that strategy paper on my own time, at 3 a.m., while my mother was dying." The board members were furiously checking their phones, pulling up old files, confirming what I was saying. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. "Jesus Christ," whispered someone from legal. "She's the architect of everything." Marcus, my fellow veteran who'd remained silent yesterday, finally spoke from his seat in the corner. "She's right. We all knew it. Emily's been carrying this company's analytical division for years. We let it happen. We stayed quiet." His admission opened a floodgate. Other mid-level employees who'd been invited to witness the big presentation began speaking up, sharing stories of Emily's unrecognized contributions, her late nights, her innovative solutions that saved deals and generated millions. Richard looked around the room, realizing he was losing control not just of the meeting but of his entire company. The board was mobilizing against him. His nephew was toxic, and the woman he'd allowed to be humiliated was walking away with all the institutional knowledge that made Redwood function. "Please," Richard said one more time, his voice barely above a whisper. "Emily, please, don't leave like this." I picked up my laptop, my resignation letter still lying on the table like an accusation. "You know what the ironic part is, Richard? If you had just given me credit, just once, I would have stayed forever. I didn't need fame or fortune. I just needed to not be invisible." I turned to Jake, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "You were right about one thing yesterday. Nobody at Redwood will remember my name, but that's because after today, there might not be a Redwood to remember." The room erupted in chaos, board members demanding Richard's resignation, Jake trying to defend himself, lawyers scrambling to assess the damage. But I didn't stay to watch. I walked out of that boardroom with my head high, leaving behind 19 years of being overlooked and stepping into a future where my work would finally bear my name. As the elevator doors closed, I heard Richard Donovan's final, desperate shout, You can't leave. The systems won't work without you. No, I thought, as the elevator descended. They won't. The elevator descended 42 floors, each number counting down like the final seconds of my old life. When the doors opened to the lobby, I stepped out into what felt like a different world. The morning sunshine streaming through the glass atrium no longer felt oppressive. It felt like possibility. My phone hadn't stopped buzzing. Texts, emails, LinkedIn notifications. 19 years of being invisible had ended in the most visible way possible, but I ignored them all except one, a voicemail from Harold Steinberg. Ms. Carter, I meant what I said. Steinberg Industries needs someone with your talent and, more importantly, your integrity. We can discuss details whenever you're ready, but I want you to know, your name will be on everything you create. Call me. I walked through the revolving doors of Redwood Capital Partners for the last time, my Armani suit catching the wind like a victory flag. Behind me, through the glass, I could see security guards rushing toward the elevator banks. The chaos was spreading. By the time I reached my car, the financial news was in full meltdown mode. My phone screen showed notification after notification. Redwood Capital in crisis. 50M deal collapses in boardroom disaster. The woman who brought down Chicago's finance giant. But the sweetest message came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Walsh, the woman who'd stolen my innovations 7 years ago. Emily, I'm sorry. For everything. You deserved better. Too little, too late, Jennifer. But at least she knew it now. I drove home in silence, processing what I'd done. There would be consequences. Of course. Richard Donovan was vindictive, and Jake would need someone to blame for his humiliation. They'd probably try to sue me, claim corporate sabotage, theft of intellectual property, but I'd been careful. Everything I'd built was documented as my creation. Every line of code had my signature. And I hadn't destroyed anything. I'd simply required authentication for my own work. That evening, at 6:30 p.m., the news broke properly. The Financial Times ran a feature story. The invisible woman who visible shook Wall Street. The journalist had done her homework, tracking down former colleagues, analyzing deals I'd worked on, painting a picture of systemic discrimination that resonated far beyond Redwood. My phone rang, unknown number. Emily Carter? The voice was familiar but unexpected. Margaret Chen from Redwood's board. Margaret, I wanted you to know. Richard Donovan submitted his resignation an hour ago. The board accepted it immediately. Jake has been terminated with cause, and we're conducting a full review of compensation and recognition practices. That's good, I said, not sure how to feel about the aftermath I'd triggered. We'd like to offer you the position of Chief Analytics Officer. Your terms, your conditions, your name on everything. I almost laughed. Margaret, with all due respect, you had 19 years to offer me that. The fact that it took burning down a $50 million deal to get your attention tells me everything I need to know about Redwood's values. I understand, she paused. For what it's worth, we should have seen you. I should have seen you. After I hung up, I sat in my apartment, looking out at the Chicago skyline. Somewhere in that forest of glass and steel, Redwood Capital Partners was scrambling to understand systems I'd built, trying to reverse engineer 19 years of institutional knowledge. They'd probably need to hire a team of 10 to replace me. 3 days later, I started at Steinberg Industries. Harold Steinberg himself walked me to my new office, a corner suite with my name, Emily Carter, Senior Vice President, etched in glass on the door. You know, he said, that presentation disaster saved me from acquiring a fundamentally broken company. I should thank you. You're welcome, I said, running my fingers over my nameplate. Jake Donovan has been making the rounds, trying to get hired elsewhere, Harold mentioned casually. Nobody will touch him. The audio of him humiliating you has become a cautionary tale in every HR department in the city. I thought about Jake, probably sitting in his expensive apartment, sending resumes that would never be answered, his career destroyed by his own arrogance. I waited to feel guilty. I didn't. And Redwood's stock dropped 30% yesterday, Harold added. Turns out when investors learned that one person was essentially running their entire analytical operation and that person left, they lost confidence. The board is in full crisis mode. 6 months later, I received an invitation to speak at the Chicago Women in Finance annual conference. The topic: the cost of being invisible. How systemic bias nearly destroyed a financial giant. Standing at that podium, looking out at an audience of 500 women who knew exactly what it felt like to be overlooked, I thought about that lunch where Jake had mocked me. He'd said nobody would remember my name. He was wrong. Everybody remembered my name now. It was on the cover of Forbes. It was in Harvard Business Review case studies. It was whispered in boardrooms as a warning. Don't pull an Emily Carter situation. But more importantly, my name was on my work. Every analysis, every model, every brilliant solution that had once been claimed by others now bore my signature. After 19 years of being invisible, I was finally, undeniably, unforgettably seen. Jake Donovan had given me the push I needed to stop accepting crumbs from the table I had set. His cruelty had been the catalyst for my liberation. In trying to humiliate me, he'd handed me the keys to my own power. You were right about one thing, Jake, I said into the mirror that morning, practicing my conference speech. In the end, confidence does sell deals, but confidence without competence, that just sells disaster. The woman in the mirror smiled back, not the invisible analyst who'd accepted 19 years of erasure, but Emily Carter, the woman who'd brought down a giant simply by requiring recognition for her own work. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies, it's simply refusing to let them make you invisible anymore. And when they realize that their empire was built on your invisible foundation, well, that's when they understand that the person they dismissed as nobody was actually everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story of justice and vindication. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and I'd really appreciate hearing your thoughts. Have you ever felt invisible in your workplace? How did you handle it? Let's discuss in the comments.